Welcome back to Daniel. This time let's dig into a couple of examples of the revealing dreams and visions in the book and see what's going on. I mean, are there any connections between them? How do the visions and dreams of 2 through 7 compare or contrast with what we find in 8 through 12? So turn in your Bibles, if you would, to chapter 2, and let's take a look at a dream that frustrated old King Nebuchadnezzar. The narrative gives us some background into the religious culture of the ancient Near East. Did you notice the key role that's played by the magicians and conjurers and sorcerers and master astrologers in guiding the king? The problem is, he wants them not just to interpret the dream for him, he's forgotten it. So he expects them to play back his own dream for him and then explain it. Well, they can't. And that can be most disarming, right? Look at the last part of verse 5. Disarming, get it? Well, as the narrative develops, what Nebuchadnezzar is asking for is an absolute impossibility. Verses 10 and 11. In his fury, the king decrees that the whole union membership should be slain, and Daniel gets swept up in the dragnet. Well, Daniel appeals for a little time, and he and his buddies pray for God's wisdom and for God's compassion on these condemned Gentiles. And that's a powerful side note. God responds. And watch how Dan responds. What do you make of the theology of 2:20? What do you make of the theology of verse 21? Compare this claim with verse 37. And verse 22, think about that. So, what's the dream? How does Dan know this? Nebuchadnezzar dreamt of a huge statue. And Dan claims that there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. See, Dan has a theology of a revealing God. Well, this statue is breathtaking. The head was what? Verse 32. And then Daniel focuses on the chest and arms of what? Then what? Belly and thighs were bronze, and the lower legs were made of iron, and the feet were part iron and part clay. Anything else significant in the dream? Verse 34. A stone cut out of the mountain, hands free, and it crushes this last empire, and the whole statue is crushed. But that stone, it becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. So Nebuchadnezzar now wants the second part of the assignment, eh? What's all this mean? And Dan's happy to oblige. What's the significance of the head of gold? Verse 37, verse 38. Okay? So Dan and Neb and the audience, including us now, know that the first segment of the great variegated statue represents the Babylonian Empire. And though the subsequent parts aren't as specifically identified, Daniel's clear that they represent successive kingdoms, right? Verse 39, after you there will arise another kingdom, and then another third kingdom of bronze that will rule the earth. So at least number 1 and number 3 are not petty little fiefdoms, but more like what we might call an empire. So maybe 2 is an empire as well. Well, there's gold and silver. Those are elements. I mean, they're pure metals, but bronze of the third empire is an alloy, isn't it? Comprised of copper and tin. I wonder if that pairing has any significance. And the fourth empire is comprised of iron and clay, and a big deal is made of that diversity in verses 41, 2, and 3. But what's the punchline of this revelation given to Daniel? Right, verse 44 and 45. Daniel's God is going to replace these empires with an indestructible empire that will endure forever. Wonder what that might be about. Well, let's hop over to the other end of the Aramaic section of prophetic history of the Gentiles. Chapter 7 records a dream that Daniel had in the first year of Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son, co-regent. It was comprised of a weird and wonderful menagerie. I mean, there was a lion with eagle's wings and a bear-like creature and a leopard that had 4 wings and 4 heads. Wonder about that. And then there's this unclassified beast with large iron teeth and 10 plus 1 horns. And there's trouble in River City, I mean in the horn section. But what's the text say? The Ancient of Days takes his throne. The books are open. The beast was slain, and the Son of Man shows up and is presented to the Ancient of Days. And look at verse 14. This dream ends with an everlasting dominion that will not be destroyed. And check it out. For Abe, sure enough, but it involves all the peoples and nations and languages. Wow. Given the description of this menagerie, it's not a stretch that this was a nightmare for Dan. Look at verse 15. He wants to know exactly what all this means. So, was the meaning revealed? Or is Dan left hanging in suspense? As the explanation is provided to Dan, do you see a parallel with the meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream? I mean, 4 successive empires, superseded by an everlasting kingdom, ruled over by the Son of Man, verse 13 and 14, and possessed by the people of the highest God forever, verse 22, and again in verse 27. But not before some serious conflict with the last of the latest empire. So, let's switch to the Hebrew section. Look at the prophetic history of Israel. Chapter 8 reports a vision given to Daniel. There was this rambunctious 2-horned ram at the canal, then a buck goat with a unicorn from the west, then a vanquished ram, and then that single horn was broken off the buck goat, but 4 horns grew in its place, and then one more little horn. This little horn grew huge and arrogant, but eventually it's killed. And after a whole bunch of turmoil, by the end of 814, the holy place is properly restored. So, what's this all about? Now we get to some more specific correspondence as Gabriel explains the meaning to Dan. Gabe says this vision, look at 8:17, pertains to the time of the end. Verse 20, the ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire. Verse 21, the goat represents the Hellenic Empire. We know from this side of history was established by Alexander the Great and then divvied up among his 4 generals, the 4 horns that replaced the unicorn in verse 22. And then there's this troublesome little horn that represents the evil eschatological Antichrist. And Daniel, though he wasn't informed this much detail from our side of history, it seems that this Antichrist was prefigured by Antiochus IV. Think about it. We'll see in a bit.